America's national debt just hit $36.2 trillion. That's $108,000 for every single person in this country. But here's what they're not telling you. We're not at the beginning of a debt crisis. We're at stage 4 of a 6-stage collapse cycle that's destroyed empires for 500 years. Spain went through all 6 stages, collapsed in 1557. France went through all 6 stages, collapsed in 1789. Argentina went through all 6 stages, collapsed 5 separate times in the last century. The pattern is identical every single time. 6 predictable stages, 6 points of no return, and right now, America is at stage 4. Let me show you exactly where this goes, because stage 5 is currency crisis, stage 6 is total systemic collapse, and we're closer than you think. This isn't speculation. This is pattern recognition across 500 years of monetary history. The same mechanics, the same debt levels, the same government responses. You're watching your purchasing power vanish in real time. You lost 23% since 2020. That's not inflation, that's stage 4. Here's what you need to understand, and here's exactly how to position yourself before stage 5 hits. This is happening right now. To understand why America's debt position is so dangerous, start with what the 6-stage debt cycle actually is. Most people think national debt is just money the government owes. Here's the reality. National debt is a wealth transfer mechanism that moves purchasing power from citizens to the state through deliberate currency debasement. Every empire that accumulates excessive debt follows the same 6 stages. Stage 1 is productive borrowing. The government borrows to build infrastructure, fund wars, expand territory. The debt generates real economic returns. Stage 2 is unproductive borrowing. The government borrows to fund consumption, not investment. Social programs, bureaucracy, interest payments on previous debt. No economic return, just spending. Stage 3 is the exponential phase. Debt grows faster than GDP. The government now borrows just to pay interest on existing debt. This is where the math becomes impossible. Compound interest takes over. Stage 4 is financial repression. The government manipulates interest rates below inflation. They force citizens to accept negative real returns. Your savings lose value automatically. They have no choice. The debt is too large to service at market rates. Stage 5 is currency crisis. Foreign holders dump the currency. Domestic holders flee to hard assets. The government loses control of interest rates. Inflation accelerates beyond their ability to manage it. Stage 6 is collapse. Total systemic failure, hyperinflation or debt default or both. The currency resets, wealth is destroyed, society restructures. Here's the critical mechanism. Between stage 4 and stage 5, there's a window, maybe 5 years, maybe 10. The government knows collapse is coming, so they prepare. They change laws, they control assets. They position themselves to survive what kills everyone else. Let me show you the math. In 1980, US national debt was $907 billion. GDP was $2.9 trillion. Debt to GDP ratio was 31%. Manageable. By 2000, debt hit $5.6 trillion. GDP was $10.3 trillion. Debt to GDP ratio was 54%, still manageable. Today, debt is $36.2 trillion. GDP is $27.4 trillion. Debt to GDP ratio is 132%. This is stage 4 territory, but here's the thing. The ratio matters less than the trajectory. US debt increased $1.8 trillion in just the last 6 months. That's $10 billion per day, every single day. At current rates, debt will hit $50 trillion by 2030. Interest payments alone will consume 100% of tax revenue by 2031. That's not a projection. That's just math. This is why stage 4 transitions to stage 5. The debt becomes unserviceable. Even with financial repression, even with artificially low rates, the numbers stop working. Now, here's what makes this different from a normal recession. Normal recessions are cyclical. Markets crash, recover, repeat. The 6-stage debt cycle is terminal. Once you reach stage 5, you don't recover. You reset. This has happened before. Let me show you. Spain entered stage 4 in 1543. Here's what happened. By 1557, interest payments consumed 68% of all crown revenues. Philip couldn't pay, so on June 1st, 1557, he declared a suspension of payments, Spain's first sovereign default. The mechanism was simple. Philip converted all short-term loans into long-term bonds at 5% interest. Bondholders lost 70% of their principal value overnight. Bankers across Europe went bankrupt. The Fugger banking dynasty collapsed. But here's the key. Philip announced the default, but he prepared for it years in advance. Between 1553 and 1557, he moved state assets into silver and gold. He seized merchant ships. He nationalized American colonial mines. When the default hit, the crown survived. The citizens didn't. After 1557, Spanish citizens lost 40% of their purchasing power within 3 years. Food prices tripled, wages stagnated, the empire never recovered its previous economic position. Spain defaulted again in 1560, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647. 6 more times. Same pattern: excessive debt, unserviceable interest, strategic default, wealth transfer from citizens to state. Now let's look at France. By 1788, France was at stage 4. National debt was 4.5 billion livres. Annual revenue was 503 million livres. Debt to revenue ratio of 9-1. Interest payments alone consumed 50% of the budget. King Louis XVI tried financial repression. He capped interest rates at 5% while inflation ran at 12%. Negative real returns. Savers were destroyed. It wasn't enough. On August 16, 1788, the French Treasury suspended all payments. They couldn't service the debt. 3 weeks later, they recalled the Estates General for the first time since 1614. 14 months after that, the French Revolution began. But here's what happened to regular French citizens. Between 1789 and 1796, France issued assignats, paper currency backed by confiscated church lands. They printed 45 billion assignats. The currency lost 99% of its value. Anyone holding cash was wiped out. The pattern is repeating. Stage 4 debt crisis, failed financial repression, currency collapse, wealth destruction. It's happening again right now. Here's what's happening right now in America. First, look at the debt acceleration. On June 3rd, 2023, Congress suspended the debt ceiling. In the following 4 months, the Treasury issued $1.2 trillion in new debt. That's faster than any peacetime borrowing in American history. The Congressional Budget Office released projections in February 2024. They show interest payments on the national debt reaching $892 billion in 2024. That's more than the entire defense budget. By 2034, interest payments will hit $1.6 trillion annually. That's more than Social Security, Medicare, and defense combined. Second, financial repression is already here. The Federal Reserve held interest rates at 0% from March 2020 to March 2022. During that same period, official inflation averaged 5.4%. Real interest rates were negative 5.4%. If you held $100,000 in savings, you lost $5,400 in purchasing power every year. That's stage 4 financial repression. Even after rate hikes, real rates are barely positive. The Fed funds rate is 5.33%. CPI inflation is 3.1%. Real rate is 2.923%. But CPI dramatically understates real inflation. Using 1980s methodology, real inflation is closer to 8%. That means real rates are still negative 2.7%. Third, look at insider positioning. In March 2024, the World Gold Council reported central bank gold purchases of 1,037 tons in 2023. That's the second highest annual purchase on record. China's central bank added 225 tons. Poland added 130 tons. Singapore added 77 tons. They're not buying gold because they think the dollar is strong. They're buying because they know what's coming. Fourth, examine corporate behavior. In 2023, S&P 500 companies spent $795 billion on stock buybacks. They borrowed money at 5% to buy back shares. Why? Because executives know inflation will devalue the debt. They're leveraging up before currency debasement accelerates. Fifth, watch the Treasury market. In October 2023, 10-year Treasury yields hit 5.02%. That's the highest level since 2007. The bond market is pricing in risk. Foreign holders are demanding higher returns. Japan reduced Treasury holdings by $227 billion in 2023. China reduced holdings by $117 billion. This is stage 4, turning into stage 5. Foreign creditors are exiting. Sixth, look at executive actions. On March 9th, 2022, President Biden signed Executive Order 14067. It directs the Federal Reserve to explore a central bank digital currency. The order specifically mentions financial inclusion and combating illicit finance. Here's what that really means. A CBDC gives the government direct control over every dollar you hold. They can track it, they can tax it, they can freeze it. They can program it to expire if you don't spend it fast enough. This is not conspiracy, this is policy. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston partnered with MIT to develop a digital dollar prototype called Project Hamilton. Phase 2 was completed in February 2024. The technical infrastructure exists right now. 7th, examine bank failures. In March 2023, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. Signature Bank collapsed. First Republic Bank collapsed. Total assets of $532 billion vanished in 8 days. The FDIC and Treasury arranged emergency bailouts. They guaranteed all deposits, even above $250,000. Why? Because a full bank run would expose the insolvency of the entire system. Stage 4 requires keeping confidence alive, even if it means unlimited bailouts. This is happening right now. Stage 4, financial repression with visible cracks showing. Stage 5 is next. Here's exactly how this works. Let's say the US Treasury needs to roll over $9 trillion in debt in 2024. That's the actual number. $9 trillion in existing bonds that mature and must be refinanced. When those bonds were originally issued, interest rates averaged 2.3%. Now rates are 5.33%. The Treasury must refinance at higher rates. Here's the math. $9 trillion at 2.3% costs $207 billion in annual interest. $9 trillion at 5.33% costs $480 billion in annual interest. That's an extra $273 billion per year just on rolled over debt. But the Treasury also needs to borrow new money to fund the deficit. The 2024 deficit will be approximately $1.8 trillion. So total new borrowing is $9 trillion plus $1.8 trillion. That's $10.8 trillion in bond issuance in a single year. Now here's the problem. Who's buying? Not foreign central banks. They reduced holdings by $344 billion in 2023, not commercial banks. They reduced holdings by $195 billion, not pension funds. They're underwater on existing bond portfolios. The only buyer left is the Federal Reserve. So the Fed has two choices: let interest rates rise until someone buys, or restart quantitative easing and buy the bonds themselves. If rates rise, the government goes bankrupt. Interest costs become unserviceable. If the Fed buys the bonds, they print money. That's direct monetization of debt. That causes inflation. Either way, you lose. Higher rates mean recession. Money printing means inflation. Both destroy purchasing power. Now let's walk through the cascade. The Fed chooses money printing. They announce QE5 in 2025. They commit to buying $2 trillion in treasuries over 12 months. When the Fed prints $2 trillion, that money enters the economy. It doesn't create goods or services. It just bids up prices. Inflation accelerates from 3.1% to 8%, then 12%, then higher. At 12% inflation, your savings lose 12% per year. A $50,000 nest egg becomes $43,800 in year 1, $38,544 in year 2. 30,908 years in year 3. You lose $16,080 in 3 years. All of it gone to inflation. But here's where it gets worse. Once inflation hits 12%, people panic. They try to convert dollars into hard assets. Real estate, gold, stocks, anything. Mass flight from currency. That's stage 5. Currency crisis, loss of confidence, accelerating inflation. The government responds with capital controls. They restrict money movement, they freeze accounts, they force conversions to CBDCs at unfavorable rates. This is the mechanism. Unpayable debt forces money printing. Money printing causes inflation. Inflation causes currency flight. Currency flight triggers controls. Controls complete the wealth transfer. Who wins and who loses? Federal government. They owe $36.2 trillion. Inflation at 12% annually reduces the real value of that debt by $4.3 trillion per year. They win through debt devaluation. Asset holders, people who own real estate, stocks, gold, Bitcoin, these assets appreciate in nominal terms during inflation. A $500,000 house becomes $650,000. The asset holder gains $150,000. That's a 30% nominal return. Debtors with fixed rate loans. If you have a 30-year mortgage at 3.5%. Inflation makes that debt cheaper. Your $300,000 mortgage becomes worth $225,000 in real terms after 5 years of 8% inflation. You effectively refinanced at negative rates. Connected insiders, people who know the playbook, they position themselves early, they move into hard assets before devaluation. They leverage up with fixed-rate debt before inflation hits. They structure wealth to avoid controls. Corporations with pricing power, companies that can raise prices faster than costs, food producers, energy companies, pharmaceutical firms. They pass inflation to consumers and maintain margins. Savers, anyone holding cash or treasury bonds, you lose 12% per year in purchasing power. A $100,000 retirement account becomes $88,000 in year 1, $77,440 in year 2, $68,147 in year 3. You lose $31,853 in real wealth. Fixed income retirees. If you're on Social Security or a pension, payments increase maybe 3% per year. Inflation runs at 12%. You lose 9% annually. A $30,000 pension buys $26,300 worth of goods in year 2, $23,144 in year 3. Workers without wage growth. Wages lag inflation. They always do. If inflation runs at 12% and wages increase 5%, you lose 7% per year. A $60,000 salary buys $55,800 worth of goods in year 2, $51,906 in year 3. Renters, rent increases match or exceed inflation. If rent is $2,000 monthly, it becomes $2,240 after year 1, $2,509 after year 2, $2,810 after year 3. That's an extra $9,720 over 3 years. But your wages only increased 5% per year. Small businesses without debt. If you saved cash to grow your business, that cash loses value. $200,000 in working capital becomes $176,000 in purchasing power after year 1. You can't buy the same inventory. You can't expand. You're stuck. Bondholders. If you bought a 10-year treasury at 2% in 2020, you locked in negative real returns. Inflation at 8% means you lose 6% per year for 10 years. A $100,000 bond is worth $54,346 in real terms at maturity. Here's what this means practically. You're paying $450 for a dozen eggs that cost $250 in 2020. That's an 80% increase, but your wages up 18% if you're lucky. You lost 26% of your purchasing power in 4 years. That's stage 4. Stage 5 is worse. Here's what you need to do. Now, first, reduce cash holdings. Keep 3 months of expenses in checking, no more. Every dollar beyond that loses value daily. Open a high-yield savings account earning at least 5%. Transfer excess cash immediately. That's defense. It won't beat inflation, but it reduces losses. Second, buy hard assets. Target 10 to 20% of liquid net worth in gold and silver. Physical metal, not paper contracts. Buy American Gold Eagles or Canadian Maple Leafs. Store them in a home safe or private vault, not a bank safety deposit box. Banks can freeze access during crises. Third, acquire productive assets. Real estate that generates income. Dividend-paying stocks in essential industries. Businesses with pricing power. The goal is assets that produce cash flow and appreciate during inflation. A rental property that generates $2,000 monthly allows you to raise rent with inflation. Fourth, leverage strategically. If you can borrow at fixed rates below 6%, do it. Lock in 30-year mortgages now. Lock in business loans now. Lock in any fixed rate debt you can handle. Inflation makes that debt cheaper. A $400,000 mortgage at 4.5% is a gift during 12% inflation. Fifth, diversify internationally. Open bank accounts in stable jurisdictions. Switzerland, Singapore, Norway. Keep 10-15% of assets outside the US dollar system. This protects against capital controls and CBDC mandates. If the government freezes domestic accounts, you have access to funds abroad. Sixth, build skills and relationships. The ultimate inflation hedge is your ability to earn more. Learn high-value skills. Network with successful people. Create multiple income streams. If wages lag inflation by 7%, you need side income to close the gap. Seventh, stock essentials now. Non-perishable food, medical supplies, basic tools, anything with a long shelf life that you'll definitely use. Buying today locks in current prices. If food prices increase 40% in 2 years, you effectively earned a 40% return. These aren't suggestions, these are requirements. You're either positioning for currency debasement or you're accepting 100% of the losses. The government already chose inflation. The only question is whether you're ready. America owes $36.2 trillion and adds $10 billion daily. The debt is unserviceable. The government will choose inflation over default. You will lose purchasing power unless you act. Stage 4 is financial repression. Stage 5 is currency crisis. We're transitioning right now. Maybe you have 3 years, maybe you have 5, maybe less. The choice is yours. Join the Economy Rewind membership for weekly updates on macro trends, policy changes, and strategic positioning. Get early warnings on Stage 5 triggers. Get detailed breakdowns of protective strategies. Share this video with anyone who's trying to understand why their savings aren't growing, why their wages don't go as far, why everything feels more expensive. This is why. Links to resources are below. Gold dealers, international banks, high-yield savings accounts. Everything you need to start positioning yourself today. The 6-stage debt cycle has destroyed empires for 500 years. Spain fell, France fell. Argentina fell 5 times. America is at stage 4. Stage 5 is next. Position yourself now. This is not financial advice. Do your own research. Verify everything I've told you, but understand the pattern, because the pattern doesn't lie. The debt cycle is real. The timeline is clear. The outcome is predictable. Your move.